Hi, everyone. How are you? On March 23rd, 2020, Connecticut's governor, as many governors around the U.S., signed an order for a shelter in place mandate. For most of us, this was the first time we experienced such a thing. Not knowing what would happen to service delivery or to their staff, leaders were forced to make very quick decisions to ensure everyone would be safe. What we probably did not know that day is that the workplace and every single one of us will be changed forever. Join us as we reflect.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. We want to say hello to all of our viewers and to our friends in Australia as well as around the world. I want to also introduce you to our awesome co-host, Peter Blakely and Rebecca Tuttle. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
Rebecca, how are you doing?
I'm great. You know, you find yourself in the green room like this when they're playing our jingle. You know, I
love
see you doing that, Cynthia, while it was going. It's a
I
great
love
tune.
Yes, I do. So I started a little dramatic, reflecting on 2 years ago. Last month, we were mandated to stay in our homes. And
On the one hand, I'm like, wow, 2 years, and then really, it's only been 2 years. It
Yeah.
sort of feels like forever.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really interesting thing. It feels like yesterday, but it also feels like forever.
Yeah.
And so for some of us, that meant working from home. But then we have leaders who still had to provide services, run organizations, and care for their staff. And I have to tell you, this was uncharted territory for many of us. And so we wanted to take some time and reflect in the last 2 years by way of a survey that was done in partnership with Field Partners and the nonprofit Connecticut Alliance. So, but before we get in, what's the last 2 years been like for the two of you leading your organizations?
Yeah, it's been tough. So there are some things about the adjustment that have been really good, that have been really productive. But some of, like we were talking about before the show, some of the fun parts of doing our jobs went away. Right? I don't get to visit programs. I don't get to talk to youth face to face. All of that. It's tough.
Yeah, I get that. Rebecca, what's it like leading an organization these past 2 years?
Well, I hear what Peta is saying. I feel the same. You know, you have a sense of mourning from the enjoyable destinations you used to travel to. However, it's really grown my ability to serve because my clients have expanded even more so throughout the country. So I think it's been a win-win in that regard. But, you know, there are some clients I'll probably not meet, if not, you know, for a few years yet, depending on how this goes. So meeting someone and then hugging them in person are two different things, you know?
Yeah. So Rebecca, you are also a teacher. Do you miss teaching in person?
I do. I traveled to 18 cities just before COVID hit, and you know, I tried to get as much traveling as I could. Just it's a great way to see the country and learn about how my work is being done around the country. I do miss that. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely miss the energy that you get from being in a room with people. It feels, to Peter's point, it feels like work, right? Because there's less play. And so
Right.
that's been challenging. But the innovation that has come out of these last 2 years has been extraordinary. I have always For example, I have always wanted to go paperless. And I
And now you are.
90%, because I have worked in the last 2 years in multiple states, multiple countries. Well, one country, two countries, and so I travel often now, post 2 years, and I've had to be paperless, and it's like, oh wow, this is what it took.
Mhm.
Like the whole world had to have a global pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, think of all those little things that we thought would be good in the workplace that we couldn't quite implement, like going paperless,
Yeah.
right? Like not having staff meetings.
Right, meeting just to meet. Those went out the window.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Going to
You
the
know what?
office unnecessarily. Yeah.
I think about one of the episodes that we had recently, or I think maybe it was Cynthia, you were talking about turn your camera on during the meetings. It makes it more
Yeah.
personable.
Yep.
Don't be afraid or shy from just showing people who you are. And
Yep.
Peter, you really focused on, you're coming into our living rooms, our home offices, and I think it opened up a whole nother layer of exposure for a lot of
Yeah.
people in business of what the struggles are and how people really want to work.
It's made us think completely differently about work.
Yeah, I remember, being so stoic, right?
Yep.
Everything had to be in place. Yesterday, I was on a coaching call with a client, and my dog was just wanting to be on my lap. And I was trying to do this without.
Yeah.
And then finally I said, he doesn't know that I'm on a call. He has no idea. He's interpreting this as, well, maybe, mommy doesn't love me or mommy doesn't want me. And so he has no frame of reference. So I had to pick him up and introduce him to my client who fell madly in love with him.
Yeah.
And that's what we've become, just like an open book almost.
Right.
Right. So, yeah. Well, I have to tell you, 2 years ago, you may remember 6 months into the pandemic, FEO Partners, in partnership with the Connecticut Nonprofit Alliance, did a survey with leaders across the state of Connecticut. They then did it for the state of Rhode Island, where they wanted to get a pulse on what was it like to lead, what was happening in the organizations, and what were some of the challenges as well as adaptation. And we learned a lot during that survey. And so FEO Partners has done a follow-up survey, also in partnership with the Connecticut Nonprofit Alliance, in where we assess what's it like 2 years later. Now, I just want to remind everybody, and if you guys have a chance to look at the news, just let me know if I'm wrong. But to the best of my knowledge, we are still in a pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're still in a pandemic. It has not ended. I understand
it's not going to end. It's just going to at some point be declared an endemic.
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yeah.
And so I hear that the numbers are up again in the state of Connecticut. They're probably up in other places as well. I notice more and more people are getting regular colds. Remember that? We used to.
Yes. Yep.
I have not been sick, right? So that's a blessing. But now as we take off the mask and we touch more things and we don't sanitize as much, we're getting sick, which I gotta tell you, I'm welcoming. I don't know. That's it feels normal, right? To catch a cold. And so so we took some time and we wanted to share the results. Now, this survey was done in two parts. The first part was a quantitative survey that went out and was responded to by 267 nonprofits in the state of Connecticut. And we have a lot of good data, and we're going to ask the individuals from FEO Partners to come in and talk about those findings. But there was a part that I did, and that was a qualitative study with 17 leaders about digging deeper about what was that like, what has changed for them, and what do they think the future holds for the workplace. So how about we jump right in?
Yeah, let's hear
Do
it.
And see. Okay, so I'm gonna add I have a little slideshow because if you've been watching, you know I'm loving this slideshow feature. And so we call this report Reflections from the Field Leading Through the Pandemic. And so again, just to continue to demonstrate really the partnerships that have come together, but also the investment from our funders as well as other coalitions. This survey was also funded by six foundations across the state of Connecticut. So thank you to the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Connecticut Community Foundation, the Community Foundation Eastern Connecticut Northwest, Connecticut Community Foundation, and the Valley Community Foundation. Okay, so we started the first question with our leaders. What was it like in the beginning? In the onset, it is March 23rd, 2020. What was that day like? And so we heard a couple of things. Many organizations went viral and adaptations were necessary. I'm gonna bring my co-host in because I want to talk a little bit about what this means. So
I'll do it.
I'm sorry?
I'll help you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So organizations went viral. And
viral or virtual? Or both?
Virtual.
And
this seems obvious now 2 years later. Well, of course they went virtual. They had to. But I gotta tell you, if your infrastructure was not set up for that, it was painful.
Yeah. And so many not-for-profits, I think, they hadn't particularly invested in technology.
Right.
Previous to the pandemic. So the switch might not have been as easy for them. Although all organizations struggled because it wasn't just a tech issue, it was also a culture issue.
Yes. Yes. And another thing that was highlighted because of this was the digital divide.
Yeah.
That became so obvious during this time. One, with our staff, did they have the proper internet? What's that called? It's not wattage, but the strength of the internet.
Bandwidth.
I'm sorry?
Bandwidth.
Yes, to handle multiple Zoom. Also, remember our kids were home, so they were needing to be on Google Workspace.
Oh yeah.
Right, and we were on Zoom too. So you had a lot of high bandwidth activities going on in the same house at the same time.
Yeah. And we had to shift how we thought about service delivery. So I spoke to some leaders who told me that their case managers could not imagine working with someone just over the phone. That they always felt like the work had to be face to face, and that it wasn't only going home, but leaders had to help staff make that mind shift. Mm-hmm. Anything else you guys learned from your leaders, from the leaders you work with?
Every gap in the organization's communication it just became this massive cavern that got filled with assumptions and gossip, right? Because people weren't passing in the hallway, right? So things that didn't go through the formal communication channel just didn't get communicated. There was no catch up.
Yeah.
And that really, I think, highlighted weaknesses in some organizations.
Yeah. The onset of the pandemic, which I identified within the first 4 to 5 months, were also filled with complexity. So it wasn't just a crisis, right? It wasn't just one event, but we'll take you back to that time where there were multiple murders of Black individuals. And finally, the murder of George Floyd just turned this country around, and it needed to stop. And so there was a social unrest and lots of marches and protesting around that time, which then affected many staff. So leaders were now dealing with a pandemic and health issues. People are dying, kids are home. You may not have the proper technology. We are having just this terrible time in our history with losing Black individuals who are either jogging or just minding their business, sleeping in their rooms. And they're also having to deal with managing board relations, funding decreases, and no one knew what was going to happen. So, talk about all these external factors. You have complexity, not just a
Mhm.
crisis.
You have to remember too, Sin, that a lot of the clients that organizations serve are already in crisis. So a lot of grants that we've written for clients are trauma-informed care, a lot of food deserts, which increase. There were shortages of food, so access to basics was elevated. A lot of the needs of the clientele and the community skyrocketed. And if you can't serve that in the same capacity, a lot of organizations talk about adaptation. They had to find new ways of serving because you couldn't abandon those clients.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so I thought the two quotes up top really spoke to what was happening. And so the first one is from a leader who said, I had to bring people back because I could see the look on their faces. It was too stressful and we needed each other. So this was an organization that defined itself like a family. And so she decided to bring everybody back. Another ED talked about how they stopped their planning process, waiting for the pandemic to end, and then realizing, oh man,
it's not going to end.
This is not ending.
Yeah.
Which now added to the complexity. So we're talking about major things, right? I interviewed people, leaders who were merging in the middle of all of this, or on the onset, or they were changing to an electronic health record, which is a software platform, right? Like major changes they wanted to.
That's one of those adjustments that we thought was going to take 10 years, and then boom, we did it overnight. All of a sudden, we had telehealth.
Overnight.
Well, don't forget, people were dying and sick and dying with COVID. There was so much trauma that just to be able to respond to that one fire, there's an ember everywhere around you.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it really tested people's capacity, organizations' capacity, and also people's skill. I know, but I would also imagine for other organizations that skills that employees had that organizations didn't know about, which we talked about in a former episode as well, came bubbling to the surface, and they said, I'm going to respond. I can help. We can do this. And that was really admirable.
Yeah. And everything. I mean, there are a lot of things that make the pandemic unique. One, the speed of change, right? The fact that it had to happen so quickly is one thing. And the second thing is that it impacted people at all levels around the world, right? So, Rebecca, you say that a lot of these nonprofits serve families who may already be in crisis. Well, now leaders had to deal with the fact that their staff were also in crisis. Some of them talk about their board and the leaders themselves.
Right.
The leaders themselves.
Everybody's living through it.
Yeah. I want to go into the next one. Talk about how did it change leadership roles, right? So leaders talked about leading differently. And so we've also talked about that. And actually there is talk about how Peter got a shout out.
Hi, Grace. It's so good to see you.
How challenging, how we had to change how we lead. So if you tended to be a micromanager, hopefully you threw that out the window, because micromanaging did not work during this time, right? If you tended to not be an over communicator, this was the time to do that, right? So we had CEOs who would have, I was going to say coffee time, who would have Zoom time every Monday, and anyone can drop in, I learned of a leader who did videos, right? Some were fun, some were informative, and some were very sad because that was the reality of that time, right? But these two quotes again really speak to that time. I had to move, I love this, from a member of the choir to the person who was conducting. And
Cynthia, you've talked about that,
Yeah.
several times, that given all of this uncertainty and confusion, leaders had to pick one direction
Yeah.
and move everybody in that direction, and that it was okay to change directions later. It was not okay to dither and let people stew in that uncertainty, right? People had to pick a direction and go.
Yeah. We're going to put dither in our glossary of our book. Renee is with us today. Renee,
Renee.
Loving this information session. Welcome back, Renee. It's great to have you here.
So Renee was one of our guests in the very beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, and she's one who did these things, right? She gathered some information. She said, "Oh, my organization needs to be doing something different, from what they had been doing. That this is not the most important way to serve our community right this second." And she just took her entire organization in a different direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the first quote was from a leader who, a board member who leads an all-volunteer organization. And he talked about always having this collaborative nature about him and shared leadership. And, that works for many people. But during this pandemic, his board and his volunteers looked to him. And he realized that he was now the conductor and that he needed to change his approach. The second quote was from another leader who said one day she wakes up in the middle of the night and realizes, oh my, this is on me. And it changes her whole framework on leadership. So really, really impactful in how leaders led. Everyone talked about, without me asking them, decision making, how that changed. And imagine how scary this is. Mm-hmm. So you have to make decisions about people's lives. You have very little data, you have very little time, and you have no frame of reference. And yet people's lives are at stake. I've read articles where leading to the pandemic for many was a matter of life or death, right? And so I can't imagine making decisions without data, right? We so love data, and yet that's what leaders had to do. And so staff relationships also improved because leaders knew that their staff needed them. So it changed how we led. And I have to tell you that the leadership science sector is looking at, are all those other paradigms the right ones, or do we need different paradigms for leading?
And this was different from any other kind of disaster, or a lot of other kinds of disasters, in that it was happening inside the organization and outside it at the same time. So leaders are trying to deliver the services and make sure that their communities are safe and meet the increased need in the neighborhood. And also their own staff are being affected by COVID, are getting sick, are losing loved ones to COVID, are experiencing all that fear and uncertainty. And so they had to manage both internally and externally in a way that's been unusual up till now.
Yeah.
That I think is going to get more common.
Yeah, yesterday a leader took me through a journey. She said, they have a food pantry. And so they work with the larger food pantries and they get a lot of their food from those sources. But food was limited, and as well as donations. People weren't leaving their homes. And so she had to buy food for her food pantry. And I couldn't imagine going to the supermarket and having just multiple shopping carts with tons and tons of food to serve her clients and families. Like, and she had to.
I've done that before when I did case management, because you form such bonds with the clients and the families that at the end of the day, I couldn't go home from work knowing that they didn't have dinner or breakfast the next day. I mean,
Yeah.
I think a lot of this brought out the humanitarianism in a lot of us, right? And there's just no excuse. So I would go and I mean, I made $16,000 my first job out of college, right? I have all this debt and $16,000 salary, and I love my job. And I'm every time I went grocery shopping, I just bought an extra bag of food for the food pantry that we had because it was so low stocked, and the food in it was not nutritious by any means, you know.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to make sure that these little ones and the families that I was working with that had the proper nutrition that they wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, this brings up this whole other issue that we've touched on before in the context of self-care, right? But the various ways that people who are doing mission-based work are affected mentally, physically, emotionally, and financially by doing that work.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we're feeling the fatigue now.
Yeah.
And we should have a show about how leaders are beginning to exit. So those who can retire are seriously considering it. I met leaders who changed the course of their career. It was just a little bit too much, the exposure. And
we've talked to so many people. We've talked to people about the Great Resignation, and that's affected in the field and outside of the field. But everybody is doing this big re-examination of how they're spending their time and energy.
Yeah.
And with increased awareness of our mortality, is this really what we're going to do, right? And I think a lot of us are just tired. We've been doing this in this very intense way for the last 2 years, much more isolated than usual, right? Spending a lot of time at our screens than usual, and we're exhausted.
Yeah.
We're just tired. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And then I think I have one more slide. The new normal. What does this all mean? What is the future of work mean? And so the second quote really resonated with me, and I thought defined where we're headed, where this ED said, we don't have to bring people to do paperwork now into the office. We use the office to collaborate and socialize and bring connectivity. Peter, you've talked about this often.
Yep.
You've made this need for the office.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need the office to work. Many of us actually do better at home.
Yeah. Especially open plan offices were designed to facilitate inspiration and collaboration, which is, 10 or 20% of our jobs, at the expense of getting stuff done, which is the other 80 or 90% of our jobs. And I think now we've got a much better understanding of those two elements of our jobs and how to accomplish each one. I think we're going to be a lot more thoughtful about when we bring people together. Let's make sure it's worth it, right? Let's make sure that it is nourishing and building, right?
Yeah.
Particularly because I think we're always going to feel like there's an element of danger to that, right? That if you put a bunch of people in a conference room, you've got to have a really, really, really good reason for it. Right? That's just how we're going to think for the rest of our lives. And in terms of getting our work done and our efficiency, and the work capacity of a lot of people who function better on less connection and more concentration, I think we're all going to end up with combinations of work styles and places that'll work better for us in the long run.
Peter, I love that you called the conference room the danger zone.
Okay, so I am kind of an introverted person. It's always been a danger zone for me. Just this massive energy suck, right?
Yeah.
But so maybe it's just the introverts of the world are finally getting our way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think people are questioning things. I've noticed, and I'm going to end with this, and then I'm interested in Rebecca's thoughts. And I know we're running a bit over time, but I've seen a lot of growth come out of this. And so, Rebecca, are you seeing the same thing with your clients and in your work?
I am. I'm seeing different types of grants we're writing. There's been so much relief funding coming out. There is so many resources available that just weren't there. But not only that, the stringent applicant requirements have lessened, so it's easier for people to apply for funding, and they're giving multiple year funding. There is a lot that was presented to organizations to be able to survive this pandemic. What I didn't see though were an additional set of resources to help those smaller organizations that didn't have the capacity or don't have the capacity to go after these opportunities get in the game, if you will. And that's unfortunate. I think we missed the mark on that. However, we could write more grants to bring in that capacity to help those organizations do that. And that's exactly what I've been doing throughout this pandemic.
Yeah. And Rebecca, you talked last week about how much funding is still out there.
Right.
Yeah.
There's so much of it, and more is coming. Each and every quarter, more is coming. What I would focus on right now is the inflation is really getting up there. And one of the things to note is that grants are based on the previous year's investments. So we had an okay year last year with funding. And this year, if funding gets a little rocky, what you're going to see next year are less funds available. So just keep that in mind, that now's the time to write the applications for the projects and programs that you've been thinking about. I would just go ahead and raise those funds now. Also, increase your donors, increase your donations to support some of those gaps that you might potentially see next year.
Yes, thank you. And you had a show last week that talked about there is still opportunity out there. And I think we're going to have a part two because we always run out of time. Talk about, but I want to say thank you to my co-host, but also all of our listeners and to all of the leaders who stayed with their organizations, who saw it through. And if you are thinking about leaving, kudos to you. And if you're staying, kudos to you as well. Until next time, thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.